So I have this ThinkPad with a pretty bad stain on the display and a dead ThinkPad. So I was originally planning on doing a panel swap after making sure there were no signs of life from this ThinkPad. And I did test this with an external VGA port as well, so I think it's actually a dead graphics chip on the thing. But after powering it on a few times and eventually even testing if the RAM was dead, I decided, to do at first, lid swap, but I ended up having to do a panel swap. So I figured I should talk a little bit about, ThinkPad panel swaps. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about panel types. So, of course, there's CFL and LED panels on these older laptops. This doesn't only apply to ThinkPads. So CFL tubes use high voltage and are pretty much just, in other words, CFL tube is just a compact fluorescent light bulb like you see in a supermarket. So these actually age quite quickly in comparison to a LED backlit panel. So there are a few nice things about having a CFL panel in your ThinkPad though, if it is a X200, because there is a AFF S mod, which means you're not dealing with a strictly TN panel and can have slightly better aspect ratios and appearance. But I haven't done that mod, so we're gonna give a quick reference to Sebi's Random Tech, which I've seen a few good videos before from him, and he, did that mod. But I imagine the process is relatively similar, but I will say though, there are things to worry about in general about buying CFL panels used. So, they end up having dim bulbs. And it's really hard to evaluate because when it's just a part seller that's selling a bunch of these panels, you might get varying quality. In fact, I ordered one from China for a X60 that was so dim, it was an AliExpress panel, that you couldn't actually make it out unless the lights were off. But either way, there are possibilities to actually modify some of these panels to LED backlit, and some even have kits for them. So in the case of the X60, although that person never responded, you can get a X60 panel that does have a LED backlight. CFLs will also draw a little bit more power, which will actually reduce battery life. But with LEDs, they're kind of the opposite, a little bit more power efficient and a little bit more brighter. Well, they might be the same brightness. It really is just based off what the panel's output rating. I believe it's nits, or 1 candelas per square meter. I'm not gonna lie about that. I had to look that up for this video. But they typically do have brightness ratings on the panels, and if they're the same, when new, they're going to have the same brightness. But LED panels will generally keep that brightness for quite a bit longer. So now let's talk about their interfaces to the computer. So LVDS is typically an interface used to communicate with the LCD on older systems. So this LVDS connector has been in use since at least the T40 and up to the X230. It's somewhat limited if it's single channel. The dual channel LVDS systems can support higher resolutions, but often, a lot of times, panel mods will use a DisplayPort lane on ThinkPads that go from the docking station and pretty much just rob you of one of the monitors on your docking station, but in return give you a much nicer display. Okay, so now to the build. So since we had 2 laptops, we have to do 2 disassemblies, which in this case is just remove the keyboard and mouse pad and all that. So we're going to talk about, I guess, what happened originally, which was, well, I originally tried to do a lid swap, which was met with a mild degree of success, but I found out the other laptop also had a dead panel. Let's go on to, well, the next thing I did, because I actually had some extra panels, and unfortunately my LED panel that I had on hand was dead, but the nice thing about that was I had an extra inverter from the second computer, but it says caution high voltage on this, and it has a little transformer doohickey on here. So essentially, these actually do require high voltage to run, so it's a little bit wise to not have them plugged in, or maybe even let them sit around a bit like CRTs, but I've actually never been shocked by one, but I would be careful. Okay, so now that that warning's out of the way, it's time to talk about, well, so now let's talk about the panel swap with the sped up footage. So swapping the panels over was a little bit of a hard task, and I decided to clean up the panel with some microfiber cloths I had, but one of the main issues is there's quite a bit of screws in this, and it's easy to miss one or two when pulling out the panel, but once you have them all loose, it should just kind of slide out of there. But unfortunately, the back lid is actually held in by a few of the screws. So those little black screws over there, once completely removed, will end up dropping the panel as well as the back plate of the Thinkpad, which can be quite annoying. So I ended up having to screw them in during the build, then re-screw them in again after taking them out to finish the panel reassembly. So, in summary though, it did seem to work out pretty well, and don't forget your little Bluetooth module over there. But once you have everything reassembled, you can start with putting the keyboard and everything back on, and guess that's about it. You do have to take that out if you're going from a CFL to a LED backlight, because you have to swap the cable. So I guess we're going to talk about some of the things you should be worried about missing. So the first thing is, well, that little magnetic sensor on the side, and if you do have a camera module, you probably have to take out a piece of metal to get to it. I don't typically deal with camera modules, but that think light is something that should always be on your Thinkpad. So make sure that goes back in, because those are quite useful. And the magnetic sensor again. And now we're at the CFL inverter, which, as you can tell, has that transformer. So be wary of the shock if you're messing around with it when it's running. But I got a nice little clip of the footage of the display, and in fact, although it does have one tiny scratch, you can see from the very top looking down, and it is a TN panel by CFL, it is not damaged to the point where I would consider it not usable, like having a massive brown spot in the display on the LED panel, or being completely washed out like the other CFL panel I had. So, in other words, a successful build.